Great. And so now that we have concluded the business of the annual meeting more effectively than in person, I must say. And next week, the newly elected board will elect a slate of officers to serve in the coming year. And I'm delighted, that our candidate for board president is our speaker tonight, Maureen Elenga, who will talk, we're right on schedule. Maureen will talk about the bridges of Queen Anne, a topic that I find totally intriguing. And it's based on her book. I think it's called The Bridges of Seattle, which is a delightful book that you can find in every bookstore that you're used to using. And Maureen will talk. If you have questions, put them in the chat or wait until the end and you can ask them directly to Maureen. So Maureen, you're on.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for everybody who tuned in tonight for this meeting. We appreciate you very much being members of the society, and your ongoing support means a great deal. As Michael mentioned, the presentation tonight is largely adapted from my book, Bridges of Seattle. You can find out more about that and see some of my other work on my website. So let's jump right into it. When I've talked to some of my Queen Anne friends about this presentation tonight, they have said, what bridges on Queen Anne? So we're going to look at bridges on and around Queen Anne. We're going to look at 6 bridges that are used by people who live in Queen Anne, but 2 of them are actually on Queen Anne. But people today don't necessarily even know they're there because they are deck arch bridges, which means their superstructure is underneath the road deck, much like the Aurora Bridge in the picture we're looking at. So when you're driving over it, if it's not over a wide open body of water like the Aurora Bridge, if it's surrounded by the tops of mature vegetation, you can drive right over it, not even realize it. So we do have 2 really fabulous bridges on Queen Anne that we will get to. But you'll notice that these bridges, the permanent bridges, were all in the early part of the 20th century. So the first few decades of the 20th century was really a period of rapid growth for the city. Our economy was strong. We're still rolling off of the gold rush. And it was also a time where communities north of Seattle and north of Lake Union were starting to become populated and needing infrastructure. So Seattle, the Queen Anne, where we live, was actually considered North Seattle before being annexed to the city proper. So the areas in green, this is an 1891 map that shows the areas in greens that were annexed in 1891. The other parts of Queen Anne, so this is the green parts, that's parts north of McGraw. The other parts of Queen Anne, the lower Queen Anne, and which we now call Uptown, to McGraw, that was annexed to the city in 1883. And when parts of the town get annexed to the city, immediately community groups form to petition the city for infrastructure improvements. And Queen Anne had a really active and really effective community group, largely made up of women, because they were the ones who spent their time in the community, at the schools and at the homes. And so they would lobby for basic infrastructure. They started with things like sewers and water, and then it moved up, to paving streets. And well, actually, one of the first things that they successfully did was paving streets, and eventually bigger things like bridges. one of the biggest physical changes to the map you'll see, besides the fact that Smith's Cove wasn't fully filled in yet, is the changes made by the Lake Washington Ship Canal construction. So the plan, this is the 1895 map of the Lake Washington Ship Canal right-of-way, which was charted in 1895 by the Army Corps of Engineers. But the plan for this canal was dreamed up much, much earlier. It goes back to 1854, the earliest days of Seattle, when Lake Union got its name. And it was named for this vision that it would one day connect Lake Washington to Puget Sound. So here we go. But the effort started before the federal government got involved. It started out with private enterprise. So this is a view of South Lake Union in 1885. Wow. Now, I quickly wanted to ask you to remember that map I showed you for the annexation. So this was 5 years before that annexation, 6 years actually. So you notice the stands of trees. This is pretty much the cutoff of the first annexation, and then the 1891 annexation. So this is David Denny's mill here. So he and some other local businessmen formed the Lake Washington Improvement Company to try to get this canal vision built. And another thing before we move on, I want you to notice is the water's edge here. There's no roads to the north end. There's a ferry service for people who were living north of Queen Anne, or north of Lake Union. There was a ferry service that would pick people up and bring them down here near, South Lake Union today. So there was very little transportation infrastructure for these people. So it was not easy to get into downtown. So these are the canals that were dug by the Lake Washington Improvement Company. Excuse me, let me get some water. There were essentially ditches that were not navigable. You could float logs through them. Montlake Ditch was essentially a log chute. You could float a small rowboat or a canoe, but they weren't, big enough for an ocean-going vessel. But it did serve the purpose of moving logs to lumber mills. So the money for the ship canal. So when in 1895, when the federal government plotted the course of the canal out through Shill Shoal, they didn't yet have the money for it. In 1910, the River and Harbors Act, finally, the money came through, and excuse me, and work began. Now, the natural outlet of Lake Union was a small, slow creek called Ross Creek, named for the community of Ross, which once existed at about 3rd Avenue West and Nickerson. So this is how it looked when the work began. So this is actually the second Fremont Bridge. That was the first Fremont Bridge was in the same location, but it was raised in 1911 when the work started because they needed to widen the canal. So this temporary higher and longer bridge was built in from 1911 and opened in 1912. And it carried streetcar and vehicles, mostly horse-drawn wagons, but an occasional motor vehicle. And it connected the communities to Seattle via this 2-mile-long Lake Union Road, which hugged the western shore of Lake Union. And from that earlier picture that I showed you with the South Lake Union with David Denny's mill, this road hadn't been built yet. It began as a private enterprise, and then the city ended up kicking in money. It started in 1890, and when it was built, it really spurred the development of these fledgling communities in Fremont and Ross, which became known as Ross Station because they did have a train stop there. So this enabled people to move in and out of these communities by streetcar rather than having to deal with the ferries. And so these areas really started taking off. So there was a bridge at Stoneway. This bridge was constructed in anticipation. They knew that the Fremont Bridge would have to be removed entirely because the new bridge was going to be going in its place. And they also needed the War Department. This was the whole Ship Canal project was under the purview of the War Department. And they, so any bridge in the way of this project had to have a movable span. So back here you can see there was a movable span at the center. And but the people in Fremont were really not happy about this, because back then these communities, Stoneway and Fremont, it's hard to imagine now, but they were not, they were somewhat separate. And the people were concerned that this bridge was going to draw commuters away from the Fremont business district. So they were pretty bitter about it for a while, until the Fremont Dam failure. So one of the functions of the locks that exist now in Ballard is that it maintains a constant and level of the lakes. The spillway in the locks does that. Well, prior to that project being built, there had been a wooden dam and spillway built at the outlet of Lake Union, at the head, like where it trickled out to Ross Creek. And the original Fremont Bridge was just west of that. So sometimes in high, it was March, a lot of rain, the lake level rose and the dam and spillway couldn't handle it. It failed, and it sent a torrent of water, which completely washed out the center span of the temporary Fremont Bridge. So the Stoneway Bridge, seen back here, it did just fine because it was in the lake. It was east of that dam and spillway that failed. So then the community of Fremont was plenty happy that it was there. Although the center span was repaired fairly quickly, the streetcar service did not ever return to Fremont. It remained diverted to Stoneway throughout the entire project to build the new Fremont Bridge. So this is a view of the repaired temporary Fremont Bridge and its last few months of use before construction on the new one began. This picture was taken, looks like, was that March and of 1915, and it closed in August 1915. So the engineering department, so Seattle was responsible for bridges and infrastructure connected to the project that the federal government was building the locks and the canal. But Seattle had to pay for these bridges and related infrastructure projects. So there was to be 4 bridges, the bridges that exist now at Ballard, Fremont, University, and Montlake. And they explored many different types of options for crossing the bridge. There was different types of movable bridges that they considered. The center lift span would require really high towers, and the ugly high fixed bridges require condemning a lot of land because they require really long approaches. And so the Chicago style double leaf bascule, which had been developed in the 1890s, they're all, if you've been to Chicago, these bridges line the river, was really the best choice, because it has, it's called bascule from the French word for teeter-totter, the way that the leaves move up and down. And so they opened to almost completely vertical, which allows, unlimited height, but also the width required by the War Department for navigation of their fleet. Okay, so this picture here on the side, this shows the gears inside. When you're walking above on the Fremont Bridge, you can see sort of the tops of this if you look through the grating, but you can't see this part unless you're down in there. So this is the pin. It's called a trunnion, that the entire thing, the counterweight spins the entire leaf of the bridge over that. So that's how it functions. You can get the idea of how massive they are in scale compared to these steps here. So they're very very large, and they're run by 100 horsepower motors. And so those are the bridges that were selected for all of the 4 bridges that were built on the Ship Canal. Okay, so here, the Fremont Bridge piers are in place, and in the distance, you can see the Stoneway Bridge. Now, the city and residents had become accustomed to having this bridge, and they understandably didn't want to lose it. So the Seattle City Council formally requested to the federal government that they be allowed to keep the Stoneway Bridge permanently. But the War Department said, nope, it's got to go. It blocks navigation too much. And so they gave it until October of 1917 to be removed, which it then was. So the Fremont Bridge, it was completed June of 1917. It is not terribly long because it's built, the piers are right on the edge of the canal, and it was named a historic landmark in 1981. So the the Ballard Bridge. So right now we're looking at the Salmon Bay Bridge. It was also called the 14th Avenue Northwest Bridge. Now this, it says it was built in 1910, which is pretty much true, but it was built of parts of a bridge that already existed there since 1890, and it carried a couple of rail lines. It carried also vehicle traffic, wagons, occasional automobiles. So it was a very wide bridge. And this, the reason it was sort of rebuilt in 1910 is because, again, they needed a movable span to allow the bridge traffic to move through. So this was a Howe truss span that swung. It was a side swing. They swung out perpendicular. So it was sufficient for the vessels needed to pass through to build the bridge, but not enough clearance for large ocean-going vessels. So it was a, temporary solution, but because it was already there, the community of Ballard, which by this time was annexed to Seattle, they didn't have any of the hullabaloo like they did over in Fremont, because there was nothing was going to be diverted from Ballard. So Ballard voted to be annexed in 1906, mostly because the state Supreme Court had decided that Seattle did not have to provide them water from their new Cedar River watershed system. But also in part because they knew that even in 1906, they knew eventually that this bridge would have to be built, because this canal project was coming at some point. And they knew Seattle wasn't going to want to pay for it. So that was a part of why they voted to annex. So the bridge at 14th Avenue Northwest, like I had mentioned, it was very wide. And you can still see evidence of the bridge on the Ballard side. It ran between 13th Avenue West and the Queen Anne to 14th Avenue Northwest. So when you're over there near like Fred Meyer, those blocks near Fred Meyer and the Ballard blocks, there's a gravel parking strip in between, and it's really wide. And that's because this bridge spilled out into that, and the train tracks and the vehicles traveled onto the road. So that's why the road is like that. So unlike the Fremont Bridge, the Ballard Bridge has very, very long approaches because its piers are out in the middle of Salmon Bay. So as when the locks were built, it transformed Salmon Bay from a brackish water, sort of mud flat at low tide and brackish water at high tide. So it transformed that to a freshwater harbor. So they intentionally decided they would do a timber trestle approach, thinking that would be a permanent approach, because the argument was that we have such great products now to treat wood, and it's going to be in fresh water and it'll be great. So, and of course it was about half the cost of using concrete and steel. So that's what they went with. And the bridge was completed 6 months to the day after the Fremont Bridge was completed. The pace of this project did not continue so successfully. The next basketball bridges on the cut, which were the University Bridge and the Montlake Bridge, were not completed until 1919 and 1924, respectively. But on our end, what we're concerned with tonight, it was done on time, on budget. Small wonder, especially with a project that's being coordinated between the city and the federal government. So not too shabby. So now moving to the west of the hill, the Garfield Street Trestle Bridge. This was one of the earliest crossings. The earliest crossing, though, was at Dravis. That crossing was originally a wagon road. And then at this point, in 1912, this Garfield Bridge was constructed, and so there was crossings, 3 major crossings at Garfield, Wheeler, and Dravis, connecting the Magnolia community to the rest of the city. And the Magnolia community, like all areas, was growing at this time, and they had wanted a high fixed bridge to the top of the bluff. These this bridge did not go to the top. It went to roughly like Thorndike. So but they didn't have, they didn't have any prospects of getting that anytime soon. And then a fire destroyed the Wheeler Street Bridge in 1924. And this was because of there's a network of train tracks that go under these trestles, which are still there today, of course. And a spark from a train flew up and it caught the Wheeler Street Bridge on fire. So this whole bridge complex was out of commission, and the Wheeler Street part was actually never rebuilt. The Lawton was eventually, but so at this point, when the loss of that, and then the next year, so you were just down to Dravis and Garfield, and then the Garfield Bridge was damaged badly by an overloaded truck, and in 1925, quickly repaired. But it was clear the thing needed to be replaced, and they were able to, it limped along until 1929. And in late 1929, construction began on the Garfield Street Bridge. And although, the stock market had crashed, but the depression hadn't really sunk in yet, but there was still the concern for the money was there. And so the Magnolia residents were actually assessed for half of the cost of the bridge, and the city and the railroads split the costs, the other half. So it's a little unusual in the Smith Cove area, because the railroads have some responsibility. Like the Dravis viaduct, they paid for a new Dravis viaduct in 1936. So it's a little bit of a different situation over Smith Cove. But so here the construction began on the Garfield Street Bridge, which was completed in September of 1930. So again, a bridge, these gone up fairly quickly and efficiently. This is a concrete encased deck truss, another deck truss. So you don't see it's not a through truss or a through arch. So you don't see the structure when you're driving on the bridge. It was renamed Magnolia Bridge in 1960 by sort of neighborhood boosters. And the bridge has undergone extensive repairs over the years, and it was badly damaged in the 2001 earthquake and retrofitted, but it is slated to be replaced. But again, it's always a matter of the money. So meanwhile, after that first high fixed, we had that Magnolia Bridge was the first high fixed bridge in the vicinity. But prior to that, there was already calls for a need for high fixed bridges across the Ship Canal, because the 1920s was sort of becoming a tipping point where people were moving more toward commuting with automobiles than streetcars, traffic. People were frustrated with the traffic, the having to stop for boats passing. So the Seattle Times ran an front page editorial that called for high fixed bridges at 3rd Avenue West and at Stoneway to Dexter.
Hi.
Hello?
But I have to stop. Call you back.
Okay. So, the city and state, they agreed. One of the reasons that the Seattle Times was pushing for this was that in the late 20s, the Seattle-Everett Highway, which is the Seattle-Everett section of 99, was being built. And so the highway, the link in 99 was broken when you got to the Ship Canal. So you would have to divert to one of these busy, congested bascule bridges and then get back on. And so that just wouldn't do. So they ended up choosing the Aurora site because it had firmer ground to support Sister Bridge, and they went about condemning the land for that. And then the Third Avenue West Bridge was scrapped entirely. So the Aurora Bridge is a hybrid cantilever deck arch truss, which so it's this picture. I think I put it on this slide instead of the completion slide, just because I think it illustrates best what that really means. So you have the deck truss, which is this is a Warren truss that's suspended between these concrete cantilever and anchor spans. Now the Aurora Bridge, here's the picture, is just these last little road deck and truss spans going in. It signaled an end of an era in maritime history. So the War Department required the 150 feet clearance to accommodate the modern fleet, of which tall-masted ships were no longer a part. So this is the last of the tall-masted ships that was docked in Lake Union, leaving before being forever trapped by the bridge. It also signaled the end of, or the waning of, the streetcar era, because the Aurora Bridge was the first bridge built across the Ship Canal without streetcar tracks. The Aurora Bridge was state and federally funded. It was the first highway bridge constructed in Seattle. And there was a grand celebration when this bridge opened. Its official name is the George Washington Memorial Bridge, and it was dedicated on February 22nd, 1932, to celebrate the bicentennial of the first president's birth. Thousands of people gathered on the bridge. There was, the fireboats spewing water from the lake, and President Hoover unfurled a giant American flag from Washington, D.C. by pushing a telegraph key. I mean, it was a big deal. This was a big moment in sort of the maturity and development of the west coast of the country, having this highway link that stretched all the way from Canada to Mexico. So within 15 years, from 1917 to 1932, all of the existing bridges around Queen Anne were in place. Sorry. So by the time the Aurora Bridge was finished in 1932, we were really, really starting to feel the pain of the Depression. There was not money available. The city and state couldn't afford these things on their own. But infrastructure work was still needed, and people needed work. And so in 1935, we had a new administration was elected in 32, and 35, Roosevelt administration started the Works Progress Administration, and they approved funds for several projects in Seattle, including improvements to our bascule bridges. Now, the Fremont Bridge was the decking on the movable spans, which were originally on all of the bascules were originally creosote treated timber. And that was replaced with the steel mesh deck grating that is on it today in 1936. And this made it much safer. The creosote timber decking was very slippery when it was wet, and it didn't drain off because water didn't drain off. So there was several accidents and many fatalities. The first bridge in the United States to use this new technology was the University Bascule Bridge. It was the first one to be redecked in 1932. And that bridge averaged 6 fatalities a year before the decking changed. And after the decking change, there's been no fatalities attributed to slippery conditions on these bridges. So the Ballard Bridge was redecked in 34 and the Fremont Bridge in 36. Now this picture I love. Look at this guy's just riding the beam, no hard hats. OSHA would definitely frown on this today. So the Ballard Bridge approaches, right? Those well-treated timber trestle approaches didn't hold up so well. So the approaches were entirely rebuilt in concrete and steel, and this work was done in 39. So, but backtracking a bit to 1936, and it was a big year for Seattle and Queen Anne. The central waterfront seawall was completed. The boys in the boat took the gold in Berlin. And here in Queen Anne, we got 2 brand new, really remarkable bridges. And those bridges were designed by a very gifted bridge designer named Clark Eldridge. And they were among his last bridges that he designed while he was working for the Seattle Engineering Department. And then he went on to be involved with some very important projects with the State Highway Department, the Lake Washington Bridge, and unfortunately the Tacoma Narrows. This is the bridge that he's most remembered for his involvement with, even though the design he submitted that was rejected because they thought it was too expensive to build ended up being very much like the replacement bridge that was built after Galloping Gertie spectacularly failed. But so he's mostly remembered for that involvement, unfortunately, but tonight we're gonna remember him for his wonderful bridges that he designed for us here in Queen Anne, both of which were to replace existing timber trestles that crossed Wolf Creek Canyon. So this is a 1908 USGS topo map of Queen Anne, and it shows originally and naturally Wolf Creek Ravine. It's a half-mile long. It originally extended all the way to Newton Street. These dark lines indicate big drops in the depth, and this right here is Boston Street. There was a trestle bridge at Boston Street that had a 50-foot drop below it. And okay, sorry. So that portion of the ravine under Boston Street was completely filled. Boston was paved in 1934. And then the section from between Boston and Lynn, that was filled in from earth excavated for the Century 21 World's Fair, now Seattle Center. And so this portion of it was filled, and then it just sat as just this empty lot for 30 years until the Queen Anne Pea Patch was put there in 1990. So this is the site for the North Queen Anne Drive Bridge. There was a trestle here that existed before, according to many reliable sources, but I've never been able to find a picture of it. So if anyone has one or can find one, I'd love to see it. I searched everywhere I could think of. I even looked for people who might have old pictures of the Seattle Junior Academy, which used to occupy where Seattle Country Day School is today. Maybe some pictures of it in the background. No luck. Anyway, so I'll take it on good faith from the excellent historians who claim that there was a bridge here. Anyway, so it is a challenging site. It is very deep, but kind of narrow. So a timber trestle bridge, great. You know, you fill it up. It's with a trestle, but if you want to do a permanent concrete or steel bridge, it's a bit of a problematic site. So for the North Queen Anne Drive Bridge, Eldridge went with a two-hinged parabolic steel arch, deck arch bridge. That's a mouthful. So let's just, so this is 140-foot high steel arch. Two-hinged means that it's connected at 2 points to the abutments with a large pin. So it was the first of its type built in the state of Washington. And in this photo, you can see the 4-year-old at this point Aurora Bridge in the background, and which is essentially, you know, at the same height of the Queen Anne Bridge. So this beautiful, this elegant arch, it runs the height of the ravine, and this supports this very sort of thin. The whole thing seems very light and thin for what it is, and it went together. It came together very quickly. I mean, both of these photos were taken on the same day, so they had the riveted together the arches. Again, no OSHA. And they started installing the road deck transverse beams and girders and transverse beams, the road deck, on the same day. Here's a couple here observing the goings on from the edge of the ravine. So it's unfortunately today it's very difficult to, especially this time of year, perhaps when the leaves are off the tree, you can see a little better. It's hard to get a glimpse of this really gorgeous, elegant arch. And it was a cost-effective and elegant solution. It was only $66,000 to build this bridge, which you might think, oh, that was a lot of money in 1936, but not really. To build a bridge like that, it was very economical. And so here is the top of it as it looks today. Literally today, I took this photo today. So you can see there's the vegetation grown up. A lot of motorists just drive over it without even realizing they're going over a bridge. So to really appreciate it, you need to walk over it or walk under it. You know, you can go down from Mayfair Park, take the stairs down and see it from below. You can't get a view quite like this. This was taken in 1979 before it was landmarked. So you have to seek it out, but it's worth it. So the McGraw Street Bridge is the last bridge we'll look at tonight. It had its origins. Excuse me. I lost my place in my notes here. Just a second. Okay, its origins in the community effort to build the Queen Anne Boulevard. So In 1908, the famed Olmsted landscape architects, they submitted their recommendations for a parks, boulevard, and playground system throughout the entire city. And so the city took all that in consideration. They adopted a lot of the things from it, but they most of the recommendations for Queen Anne they did not, other than the Wilcox walls and some plantings on Bigelow. So again, those very active and effective Queen Anne community group, they lobbied the city to help make this happen. They themselves, the Queen Anne residents, took on $200,000 of the cost to build the boulevard in the cost of condemning land. And the city ended up, when all was said and done, kicking in $250,000. So part of that was effort was the construction of this trestle bridge at McGraw Street, which was built in 1914, built across what they called a death trap. And that was not really an exaggeration. The year before, at Lynn Street, which is a block south of this, where the street end meets the ravine, a vehicle driving at night didn't know the ravine was there, and the driver saw the Lynn Street on the other side was up higher. He thought he was approaching a hill, which in 1913, if you were driving a car approaching a hill, you had to punch it to get up the hill, which he did, and flew right off. And that accident did result in a fatality. There were other accidents that were not quite so, Dukes of Hazzardish, but that didn't result in fatalities. But there were definitely, it was problematic, and it caused accidents. And so when this bridge went in, it definitely made it safer for drivers. However, it didn't make it safer for kids. These trestles were pretty dangerous places for children. In researching this bridge, I came across all kinds of newspaper articles reporting of kids being injured. There was, they apparently played a game called bridge tag, where kids would climb and try to catch each other among the trestle, and a boy fell and was hospitalized. He was okay, but eventually, but it was a very dangerous place for kids to play. Another thing that kids like to do from immediately from the earliest times that the bridge was constructed was kite flying, because apparently the breeze that would come through from the north was so strong that you could just throw your kite in the air. You wouldn't have to run with it at all. You just throw it up and it would stay aloft, and you could just stand there and fly your kites, and which, it's innocuous enough, right? That's not a dangerous thing. However, often there were rapscallions who would position themselves in the bottom of the canyon and shoot air rifles at the kites being flown by the good little boys and girls on the bridge. So there were reports of kids, getting air rifles, almost losing their eyes. And there was even a report of a woman who, this was not an air rifle, it was, they didn't say which caliber, but a rifle was fired, presumably at kites, and it pierced the window, went through and hit her in the back of the neck, where she was sitting eating her dinner at the dining room table. But as ladies dressed a bit more elegantly in the 1920s, she had a large beaded glass necklace on, which broke the path of the bullet, so she ended up with just a little scrape on the back of her neck. But it was, you know, there was some. I'm never. It just never ceases to amaze me the shenanigans that kids got into back in these days. So, you know, just remember that the next time you're cursing your kids, grandkids, Xboxes. So anyway, so the bridge itself had been deemed unsafe and closed to traffic, but it wasn't entirely removed like the North Queen Anne Drive trestle was. It was retained and used as scaffolding. And this photo I thought was interesting because it shows, you see these workers climbing up on the bridge forms, gives you a sense of really how massive this singular arch is that supports the deck of this bridge. And you can also see here the rebar that reinforces the concrete. So this reinforced concrete technology, which was developed in like the 1890s, it allowed for bridges to be, you know, higher, lighter, and open spandrel, which makes very viewable. The spandrels are the areas between the arch, the intratus of the arch, and the deck surface. These areas, prior to that technology, these would have to just be solid concrete, so much heavier, and not didn't achieve this incredibly elegant look. So so here it is, finished. And this, let me see, hold on a second before I move on. Okay, so both of the bridges were built very quickly. They were both completed in just 8 months' time. The McGraw Street Bridge was slightly more expensive at $90,000, but still very economical and elegant solution to a pretty problematic site. So here is the view from the top today. The bridge itself is not landmarked, but the entire boulevard was designated a landmark in '79, so it essentially is. There is not actually a boulevard named Queen Anne Boulevard, and it's just a series of streets connected that are distinguished by brown street signs. So again, here the top of the bridge, you can understand why people might not even realize they're going over a bridge because it's so grown over, unless you're walking on it or seeing it from below, which is even frankly harder to see from below than the North Queen Anne Drive Bridge. But it's a beautiful, beautiful bridge, and definitely worth taking a walk over to the Queen Anne Peep Hatch. And I hope that, you know, you'll think about this talk tonight, and do some exploring around it, to take a closer look at these beautiful bridges. And for the last slide, I'll just show this was a 1936 cover of the Seattle Times celebrating Seattle as a city of beautiful bridges, and it features the Magnolia, Aurora, and here's the North Queen Anne Bridge under construction. So these were a great source of civic pride, and right here, 3 of our bridges featured. So anyway, that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much, and I will.
Bravo, thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah. I was just amazed by the absence of trees.
Yes.
Really shocking. And so that was the whole thing is a big learning experience for me. You know, I think I know so much about all this, and then I hear this talk and I realize I know nothing. So thank you.
Oh, you know plenty.
Now, does anybody, I hope if you have questions, raise your hand and maybe I can unmute you or ask you to unmute. I don't see anybody yet. Oh, Rini. Okay.
I see a chat from Connie. Oh no, from Richard Miller.
Says, hi all. I was the
Yeah.
city bridge engineer for 28
Right.
years and have greatly enjoyed the presentation so far. I would add one.
Yeah, he mentions the Gaylor Street Bridge overpass.
I would
don't know
add
where-
one Queen Anne Bridge ring the Gaylor Street overpass, access to Expedia et al. I was the lead on its design and construction in the 1990s. Wow, that's great.
I
And
don't
that's the
know
bridge,
where that is, where the Gaylor Street overpass is.
right? What did you say, Rini?
I'm wondering where the Gaylor Street overpass is.
Well, you can go and check it out. I know where it is. It's the overpass which leads to Expedia. It's got a wonderful work of art on it. And when you exit, as if you were going to Magnolia, you make a left-hand turn, and it goes over and it actually provides a rather safe bike route, if I remember correctly, through to the waterfront. So I'll show it to you on a map someday.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Anybody else? You can just unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, I will thank Maureen for this great talk. We'll have to add the Gaylor Street overpass now that we know who the designer was, and that's
Absolutely.
and thank you. And we'll build that into the record. Now, this talk has been recorded, and if I figure out how to edit the funny things we said at the beginning, trying to figure out how to work it, we will publish it on our website on qahistory.org, recent activities, and I hope you will all watch it there again to satisfy your growing curiosity about Queen Anne bridges. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you,
you,
Judy.
Maureen.
Wow.
Thank you for tuning in, everybody.
And thank you and good night.
Good night.
Good night.